Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just a season, it was a threat. When the first frost touched the fields, entire communities braced for a battle they might not survive. Homes leaked cold air, food supplies dwindled, and illness spread through villages already weakened by hunger. Trade routes froze, armies stalled, and faith was tested as darkness stretched for months. In this video, we're uncovering the real reasons medieval winters were so brutally unforgiving, and how ordinary people fought against a cold that shaped their lives, their choices, and even the course of history. The centuries between 500 and 1500 CE were not calm centuries of gentle seasons and predictable weather, but centuries that swung between climates like the turn of a massive, unseen wheel, forcing every village, every field, every person to adapt or break. The air itself was one of the most powerful forces shaping history. By 900 CE, after centuries of fluctuation, a remarkable shift had taken hold across the North Atlantic and much of Northern Europe. Winters softened, summers stretched longer. The ice that used to tighten its grip on rivers and harbors loosened. Trees grew deeper roots, crops ripened to fuller grain, and livestock found grazing more forgiving than in previous centuries. This interval, stretching roughly from 900 to 1300 CE, would later be recognized through tree rings, ice cores, and harvest records as the medieval warm period. It was a time when the climate breathed a warmer, lighter breath upon the lands of Europe. Some scholars call it the medieval climatic optimum, because the warmth was not a world-span phenomenon, but a profound chapter in the environmental story of the North Atlantic region. The temperature rises were enough to make vineyards thrive in regions that would later be too cold for grapes, stretching cultivation farther north and higher than before. Wheat and oats ripened in places that in later centuries would barely yield a crop. Population grew, towns grew, trade routes hummed. People lived in weather that felt generous. That warmth was not uniform, though. For every generous summer, there were harsher winters. For every gleaming harvest, there were pockets of drought or storm. But the broader trend stood. Temperatures were amenable enough to let farmers breathe easier. The bounties of the land, grain, fruit, livestock, spread outward into territories once considered marginal. And human ambition pushed beyond old frontiers. The Norse traveled across the ice-studded seas to settle Iceland and then Greenland by sea. 985 CE, their farms and outposts sustained by temperatures that were for a time forgiving enough for grazing and grain cultivation that would be impossible just centuries later. Yet beneath this warmth lurked the seeds of a future collapse. The environment that nurtured growth also bred dependence. Entire economic systems, crop varieties, farming calendars, trade patterns relied on climate staying kind. People did not write weather forecasts. They wrote harvest records and tax rolls, and those scrolls betray how tightly life was tied to seasonal rhythms. Too much rain, too little sun, a sudden early frost. Each was enough to tip the fragile balance of medieval life. Then, just as that climatic generosity had gradually strengthened human settlement and prosperity, a different pattern emerged. Around 1300 CE, temperatures began to drift downward, and not by a fraction that would matter in an age of coal-fired factories, but by degrees that were ruinous in a world without industrial heat or insulated homes. A shift, a turning point. Europe's climate entered what scientists now call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long interval of distinctly colder conditions that lasted into the 19th century. This was not an actual ice age in the sense of continental ice sheets advancing like silent armies across the land, but a persistent cooling that gnawed at the edges of every season. Winters lengthened, winters deepened, summers lost warmth, rain fell when it shouldn't, and snow fell heavier than memory had recorded in living generations. The transformation was not overnight. It was felt in waves, subtle then sudden. A great volcanic eruption, Mount Sumiluz in 1257, choked the skies with sulfur and ash, contributing to sharp cooling and foreshadowing the difficult centuries to come. It was one thread in a tapestry of causes: volcanic dimming of sunlight, shifts in solar activity, and changes in ocean currents all played parts in nudging the climate toward a chillier state. Glacier tongues crept downward in the Alps. Sea ice thickened in northern seas. Rivers that used to run open were choked with ice for months that once knew only short freezes. Humans felt these changes as visceral facts of life. Every inch of frost on a field in 1315, every prolonged snowstorm that broke winter fodder supplies, every flooded meadow was not just a weather event, but a matter of survival. Already by 1315 to 1317, a period of relentless rain, cold, and crop failure gripped Europe, what chroniclers later described as the Great Famine. Grain rotted in soggy fields. Cattle perished. Parchments from monastic libraries list the prices of wheat more than once, like echoes of alarm. In some regions, the price of wheat more than doubled by June 1316, forcing families to choose between starvation or destitution. Vineyards that once produced wine for feasts became barren. The Italian monks at St. Arnold Abbey recorded wine yields down by 80% in those years, an almost unimaginable decline for societies where wine was a staple of daily life. But it was not famine alone that brought home the severity of the cooling. Record after record speaks of people bearing the burden of an environment that no longer cooperated. Chroniclers noted crop failures in the fields of England, France, the Low Countries, almost everywhere across the tapestry of medieval Europe. The rhythm of planting and harvest became unpredictable. Seeds meant for sowing sprouted too late. Frost destroyed shoots before they had strength. Livestock weakened without adequate pasture. By the second and third years of failed harvests, hunger invaded the very core of medieval communities. For centuries prior, humans in medieval Europe had weathered storms and short droughts. But changes this sweeping, this relentless, overwhelmed every precaution. Social structures groaned under stress. Prices soared until barley cost more than anyone could afford. Churches filled with the ill and the starving, their prayers addressing not just sins but the climate itself. And still the cold persisted. As this new climate regime deepened, daily life was remade. Winter no longer offered only a season to endure until the planting began again. It became a gauntlet of danger. Terrible cold, unrelenting and merciless, started to dictate every move of medieval life, affecting everything from food supplies to warfare, from travel to village feasts, from health to belief. The world of the medieval climate was unforgiving, and in that unforgiving cold, the stories of human struggle, aspiration, and survival were etched into history with a clarity that no warming summer could ever erase. Each century, each colder decade built upon the last, nudge after nudge of chill, until life became not just about enduring seasons, but enduring them with courage, fear, and a tenacity forged in frost. Between the soil and the sky, medieval life balanced on a knife's edge. Every year, as the first frost loosened its grip and tentative green shoots appeared in the fields, ordinary people practiced a fragile faith that the crops would germinate, that the harvest would be enough, that this year would not be the year the earth failed them. Their entire existence, what they ate, how long they lived, whether a child survived into adulthood, depended on the whims of weather and the narrow margin between fertile bounty and terrible hunger. Peasant farmers made up the vast majority of Europe's population. They woke each dawn to the same rhythms of toil that had shaped centuries. The turning of the seasons, the heaving of plow against earth, the hope that seeds planted in hopeful spring would mature into golden grain by late summer and early fall. But the season of planting and harvest was a gamble, a contest between human labor and the unpredictable forces of nature. Their survival was not guaranteed. It was a constant struggle to tip the odds ever so slightly in their favor. From the earliest days of medieval agriculture, human ingenuity had coaxed sustenance from the land using systems like the three-field rotation, a method of growing crops in sequence on different plots to preserve soil fertility. Yet even this was no armor against the cruelty of bad seasons. For every field sown, every kernel buried in hopeful earth, There existed the possibility that an untimely frost or a cold spell would strike long before harvest. There were no insulated greenhouses, no weather forecasts whispered on the radio, no grain silos holding safety for desperate times. Just people and the land, and an alliance of weather and fate that could turn kindly or malevolent without warning. In 1315, the cruel face of nature revealed itself. Unusually heavy rains fell across much of northern Europe day after day, week after week. The soil, sodden and lifeless, refused to drink their prayers. The peasants' tools landed in mud and mire. Grain seeds, meant to germinate and grow into sustenance, simply rotted before they could take root. Fields became marshy quagmires, crops that might have fed entire villages drowned in cold water. Long before autumn could bring relief, harvests were already squandered. This was the beginning of what later chroniclers called the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a catastrophe that would crack the backbone of medieval agriculture and send shockwaves through every class of society. No corner of daily life remained untouched. It was not just one bad year. It was a collapse of cycles long taken for granted. Grain, wheat, barley, oats was the anchor of their diet. But cereals have a narrow window of growth, a fragile rhythm that demands spring warmth, summer sun, and fall temperance. In 1315 and beyond, spring was wet, summer was cold, and autumn never offered the warmth required to fully ripen grain. Every field that could have fed a family was an altar of broken hopes. People looked upon rotting stalks and barren hillsides as if witnessing an omen. But this was no omen, this was visceral reality. Before the Great Famine, medieval farmers faced short growing seasons with a stoic acceptance. They knew winters would bite, but they expected spring to restore life. They understood that even a modest summer could yield at least enough barley or rye to keep a few families alive. But this new era was different. Late springs languished in chill and rain, choking sowing and vigorous early growth. Early freezes in the fall shattered whatever fragile gains might have been made. Cold snaps descended like merciless sentinels, unannounced and unforgiving. Crops that had survived uneven growth were struck down at the threshold of promise, just as they should have been reaching full maturity. And when fields failed, the effects rippled outward into every dimension of life. Think of the grain that should have been stored for winter. In ordinary years, modest surpluses were tucked away in barns, enough to soften the hardest months. But when crops withered, grain became an almost mythical commodity. Barrels that once held wheat now held emptiness and fear. There were no backups, no emergency reserves, nothing but scarcity. And as food ran out, communities began to unravel. Families who had tilled the earth since before they could walk now fought over the bare scraps. The cheapest bread became an unattainable luxury. Salt, used to cure and preserve the blasted meat from the few animals left, became as expensive as gold when wet weather crippled salt production. Fields long tilled for generations were left barren, a testament to nature's indifference. Even animals, lifelines in themselves, fell victim to disaster. Fields that promised hay and forage now offered only wet straw that could not be cured for winter feed. Livestock weakened, starved, succumbed to disease. Horses used for plowing died in droves, robbing farmers of their primary engines of labor, deepening the cycle of scarcity. Those animals that survived carried humans into winter leaner and weaker than ever before. But it was a bleak and desperate kind of companionship. Families responded first with hope, then with desperation. They gathered wild roots in forests, scraped bark from trees, tried to eke sustenance from anything remotely edible. These actions weren't outliers. They were survival strategies in a world turned hostile. Every edible plant, every nut, every stem offered a potential lifeline for those on the brink. Adults became skeletal figures of exhaustion and hunger. Children, frail and shivering, clutched at bare ribs and hollow stomachs. Something so basic, food, had slipped beyond the grasp of millions. And yet the danger didn't stop with empty bellies. The lack of food gave rise to starvation's cruel siblings: disease, desperation, violence. Malnourished bodies could not resist the simplest infections. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, bronchitis, all ailments of damp cold, stole life from those already hollowed by hunger. With every passing week, every failing season, the toll of death rose like an unstoppable wave pounding against the frail structure of medieval society. And still, every spring after, farmers faced the same terror. Spring planting was no longer an act of renewal alone. It was a roll of the dice. If after months of work the sky chose rain instead of warmth, fields would fail once again. The risk of famine was built into every season. The margin for error vanished long ago. Medieval Europe lived with this specter of famine not as an improbable nightmare, but as an ever-present reality. That was life on the edge. That was survival at the mercy of frost and rain. Poor harvests were not merely misfortunes in the Middle Ages. They were the beginning of a chain reaction that could hollow out entire regions. One failed field could bruise a village. A failed season could break a country. And when the weather turned against the crops, when rain drowned the grain or frost shriveled it, famine stepped forward like an enemy everyone recognized, yet no one could fight. A bad year announced itself early. It began with the soil refusing to warm in spring. Seeds lay dormant in the cold, waiting while farmers paced along the ridges of their fields, knowing each delayed day was a threat to the coming harvest. By June, when wheat should have stretched toward the sky in confident green waves, the fields stood patchy and stunted. A farmer's eyes did not need numbers or measurements. They knew the harvest would fall short simply by the hesitant color of the stalks, by the silence of fields that should have been alive with growth. The town markets felt the shift long before harvest even arrived. Bread sellers grew tense. Grain merchants watched their reserves shrink. By late summer, whispers filled the squares. Grain would be scarce, and scarcity meant prices would rise. In a world where most families lived harvest to harvest, where winter might be survived but never easily endured, rising prices were the first blow of famine's hand. When harvest finally came, the crisis sharpened. Wheat sheaves that normally piled in golden stacks looked thin. Barley yields stood half of what they should have been. Oats, vital for both humans and livestock, failed outright in some regions. Every missing bushel foretold the harshness of the coming winter. Families gathered their portion of grain, measuring it not by abundance, but by its terrifying insufficiency, counting the months it needed to last and realizing it could not. Then came the hardest decision medieval people ever faced: rationing the future. A bad year forced households to reduce daily consumption, stretching every sack of grain, watering down pottage until it was little more than broth, saving bread for children, because adults could endure the hunger a little longer. But even this offered only a short reprieve. Once winter tightened its grip, there was no replenishment, no fresh vegetables, no new harvest, just whatever remained in wooden bins and clay jars, dwindling day after day. Grain prices, meanwhile, spiraled far beyond what ordinary laborers could afford. Historical records from England, Flanders, and northern France show price jumps so sharp they read like warnings carved into parchment. In 1316, during the second year of the Great Famine, the price of wheat in some English towns rose to more than twice its normal cost, while in parts of France it climbed to triple. A loaf that once fed a family for a day became something that only the wealthy could secure. The poor were pushed to the margins of survival. They loitered outside mills hoping for scraps. They gathered unripe grains left behind after harvest. They boiled weeds for sustenance. Hunger became a constant presence in every household, a cold, silent companion that grew heavier as each month passed. And then there were the winters when even that bleak pattern collapsed entirely. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 etched itself into Europe's memory with relentless precision. Heavy rains fell across northern Europe starting in May 1315 and did not stop. Crops drowned, hay rotted, livestock weakened for lack of fodder. Chroniclers from the Low Countries reported entire fields of barley rendered useless under inches of standing water. The rains continued through autumn, through winter, crushing any hope of recovery. By the spring of 1316, the famine was fully entrenched. Bread became scarce in the towns. In rural villages, it became nearly non-existent. Barges that typically carried grain along the rivers lay stranded because storms made transport impossible. In England, the price of grain rose so steeply that even those with silver coins struggled to purchase enough to survive. Cities rationed what little they had. Monasteries, usually the last refuge for the hungry, saw their storerooms depleted. But the Great Famine was not the only catastrophe of its kind. Earlier centuries bore their own scars. In 1033, a harsh famine swept through parts of Burgundy and the Rhineland after bitter frosts and torrential rains destroyed harvests. Chroniclers described entire communities wandering from village to village seeking food, a wave of displaced families moving through regions that had no surplus to share. Harvest records from monastic estates in the region show a dramatic reduction in both wheat and wine production that year. The shortage strained local markets so severely that churches opened granaries normally reserved for tithes. Another famine struck in 1194 to 1196, affecting England and northern France. After a cold summer, and early frosts cut harvest yields dramatically. Markets in Paris recorded grain prices that surged far above seasonal norms. English royal accounts from the reign of Richard I show emergency grain purchases and forced redistribution to prevent unrest. Even the king's own provisioning system struggled to feed the armies stationed abroad. Southern Europe suffered its own calamities. The famine of 1437 to 1438, following harsh winters and severe spring frosts, devastated parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Livestock mortality soared. Grain imports were delayed by storms. Urban populations, already strained by economic pressures, felt the full weight of scarcity. Every famine followed the same merciless sequence: failed crops, shrinking reserves, panicked markets, soaring prices, then the slow, grinding attrition of hunger through winter. And famine rarely arrived alone. Malnutrition weakened the body, and weakness invited disease. Even ordinary illnesses became dangerous. Fevers that would have passed in days now lingered. Respiratory infections overwhelmed communities that had no strength left to resist. Medieval physicians noted that during these years, the sick took longer to recover, and many did not recover at all. Winter, already a challenge in the best conditions, became a season of terrifying vulnerability. Towns felt the strain in different ways than villages. Urban populations depended heavily on imported grain brought by river, sea, or caravan. When storms and floods delayed transport, city dwellers saw shortages sooner. Bakers struggled to secure flour. Markets rationed the little grain available. City councils set maximum prices, but enforcement was almost impossible. Hunger pushed populations to unrest. In some towns, crowds gathered outside storehouses demanding access to grain. In others, municipal guards struggled to maintain order as desperation spread. In villages, the struggle was quieter, but no less severe. Households measured every handful of grain. Large families suffered most. The elderly were often the first to reduce their meals so children could eat. Livestock, once considered wealth, became a painful calculation, whether to keep an animal alive through the winter or slaughter it early for meat, risking next year's labor and milk. There were years when entire regions seemed suspended in anxiety, waiting for spring with a kind of fearful hope. If spring came warm and dry, if the crops grew well, the famine cycle might break. But if spring came cold, or wet, or late, the cycle began again. Because famine was never only about one season's failure. It was about what happened next. A bad harvest stole food, but the next harvest determined survival. Families who had lost livestock had fewer animals to plow their fields. Weakened laborers had less strength to sow or weed. Seeds saved for planting had been eaten out of necessity. The next harvest began with every disadvantage imaginable. And when that harvest also failed, even slightly, the consequences were crushing. The cycle tightened. The grip of hunger returned. And winter, once again, became a test of endurance. In those centuries, famine was not a distant possibility or a rare catastrophe. It was a recurring villain, often slow, quiet, and merciless. Every generation knew its touch. Every region felt its weight. And every winter carried the memory of past failures, the fear of new ones, and the awareness that in a world governed by weather and soil, survival could be undone by a single season's cruelty, leading into the next and the next without warning or mercy. A medieval house stood against winter the way a thin shield stood against a spear, flimsy, shaking, never truly safe. From the outside, these homes looked sturdy enough. Timber frames rising from the soil, walls smoothed with wattle and daub, roofs thatched in tightly packed straw. But once the cold set in, once the wind began its long, relentless hunt through every crack and seam, the truth revealed itself. These houses were never built to keep anyone warm. They were shelters in name, not in comfort. The walls offered the first betrayal. Wattle and daub, woven wooden strips plastered with mud, clay, straw, and animal dung, could stand against rain, could stand against time, but cold slipped through them like a ghost. A thin layer of earth, even when dried and hardened, could not hold warmth. When frosts arrived early, when winters stretched longer than memory, the chill penetrated those walls with ease. Inside, the air felt damp, heavy, unmoved by any heat the family tried to muster. A roof of thatch added little defense. Bundles of straw, carefully layered and tied, shed water well enough, but winter was merciless in different ways. The wind pressed in through every tiny gap. Snow melted and refroze on the thatch, dragging down its weight and finding its way inside drop by drop. The cold seeped downward with each gust, settling into the rooms below like a silent invader. Families gathered in a single main room, because that was all most homes had, clustered near the central hearth. The hearth was the heart of the house, the only serious source of heat. But the hearth came with its own trials. The fire burned directly on stone or packed earth, sending smoke upward with no chimney to guide it away. Instead, smoke rose, wavered, then filled the rafters in thick, stinging clouds. Some homes had a hole in the roof to vent the worst of it, but winter winds often forced the hole to be covered, trapping the smoke inside. People inhaled that smoke day after day, eyes watering, lungs aching, yet it was the only warmth available. And even that warmth barely pushed beyond an arm's length from the flames. Step away, just a few paces, and the air returned to its natural winter state, cold, unforgiving, indifferent. Firewood itself was often scarce. Forests were not endless, not in the way storytellers sometimes make them seem. By the High Middle Ages, much of Europe's woodland had been cleared for agriculture. What remained was carefully controlled by kings, by nobles, by monasteries. Forest laws in England, tightened during and after the 11th century, restricted who could cut what and where. Poaching a deer was serious, but cutting wood without permission could also bring fines heavy enough to break a family. In some regions, entire forests belonged to the aristocracy, protected for hunting rather than heating. Access to fuel determined who lived comfortably and who shivered through the night. Peasants gathered what they could: fallen branches, twigs, brushwood, anything that burned. But brushwood burned fast, offering only brief relief. The best firewood, oak, beech, ash, was often out of reach, locked behind laws and land rights that no common family could challenge. Even in rural communities surrounded by trees, scarcity lingered. People burned peat when they lived near boglands, dried dung when animals allowed it, anything that would feed the hearth. And still, the fire never truly conquered the cold. During the harsh winters of the 14th century, when temperatures began to drop across Europe as the Little Ice Age tightened its hold, Household accounts and monastic records describe the same conditions again and again. Frost forming on interior walls, water freezing in buckets indoors, families waking with the bitter sting of winter clinging to their blankets. Medieval blankets were woolen and heavy, but weight was no guarantee of warmth when the burning breath of the hearth faded in the night. Some families slept near the embers. Some slept with livestock in small adjoining stalls, the animal's body heat adding a few degrees of mercy to the bitter air. In regions like Scandinavia, northern England, and the Alpine valleys, winters hit with even heavier force. Timber houses in these areas had thicker walls, sometimes filled with moss or earth for insulation, but even these designs faltered during prolonged cold snaps. A timber wall, no matter how well built, leaked warmth through every beam and seam. Snow piled against the sides of houses and stayed there for weeks, sometimes months, chilling the structure from the outside until the cold felt permanent. Then came the long nights. Medieval people lived under the weight of winter darkness, the sun rising late and setting early, leaving hours upon hours when the hearth was the only light source. The fire flickered, offered warmth in small circles, but every spark consumed precious fuel. Families had to choose between light and heat, between comfort and survival. Many chose dimness, conserving firewood for the coldest moments. Inside those houses, the air felt thick with smoke and breath thin with warmth, always on the edge of freezing. In towns and cities, homes pressed tightly together, rows of timber-framed buildings with narrow alleys between them. The closeness helped a little against the wind, but it also increased the risks. Fires were constant threats. A single stray ember could ignite a row of thatched roofs, turning a neighborhood into a catastrophe. This danger kept households cautious, often forcing them to dampen their fires early or reduce them to embers at night. Even wealthier households faced challenges. Stone manors and castles offered durability, but stone walls absorbed cold like a sponge. Without tapestries, without braziers burning through the night, the interior of a stone residence could be colder than the air outside. Castles had great halls with massive fireplaces, but those large spaces demanded enormous amounts of fuel. Only the richest could afford to keep such fires burning consistently. And still, even with wealth, winter crept through the stones. Historical accounts describe frost forming on the inside of castle windows during the particularly harsh winters of the 15th century. Servants shivered in chambers barely warmed by small braziers. Royal households issued additional cloaks, furs, and woolen garments during long cold spells. Comfort existed, but warmth, true warmth, was elusive. Meanwhile, peasants endured conditions far harsher. They sealed cracks in walls with mud and straw. They hung cloth or skins over doorways to block drafts. They huddled together at night, sometimes multiple families sheltering in a single house when temperatures plunged. The cold was not simply discomfort, it was a threat to survival. Children suffered most. Chroniclers noted that in particularly cold winters, like those recorded between 1309 and 1317, overlapping with the years of the Great Famine, families struggled to keep the young from freezing during the night. Extra layers of wool were piled over them. Parents placed them closest to the fire. But a hearth that burned low for lack of wood could not fight the cold outside, the cold that seeped into bones and breath and life itself. Every house stood as a fragile barrier between its inhabitants and the unforgiving winter. A barrier that held, but barely, always on the edge of failure, always trembling in the wind. And year after year, as winters grew colder and more unpredictable, those walls of wattle, daub, and timber faced a truth that no amount of human effort could overcome. Because the cold never cared, and the houses that sheltered medieval families could only stand against it for so long. Wool was the first shield against winter. Coarse, scratchy, stubbornly practical. It clung to the skin with a heaviness that spoke of fields full of sheep and hands that had carded, spun, and woven every strand by force of necessity. Everywhere in medieval Europe, from the damp coasts of Ireland to the bare winds of Bohemia, Wool became the material that stood between a family and the cold that sought to drain the warmth from their bones. It absorbed moisture, held odors, and took days to dry. Yet it was the fabric people returned to again and again, because there was nothing else. Linen rested beneath it, the inner layer worn even in winter, woven from flax grown during warmer months. It was light, not warm, but essential for comfort, a thin barrier the skin could tolerate. Yet linen did nothing to block wind. A peasant walking across a frosted field in January would feel the cold pierce through wool, then linen, then straight into the body, each gust a reminder of nature's power. Fur, thick and coveted, became the luxury of those who had the means to secure it. Squirrel, fox, beaver, wolf, each carried status. Monarchs wrapped themselves in trim lined with ermine, especially prized from the 12th to 15th centuries. Nobles traded heavily for Baltic pelts. City records from 1310 in England list fur among the most expensive imports during harsh winters, when a wealthy doubled their orders. Below them, merchants bought patches of cheaper furs, sewing them into mantles for warmth. The poor had animal skins only if they had slaughtered a goat or sheep at the end of autumn, and even then, the hide might be used for tools instead of clothing. Children in rural villages often passed the cold season wearing garments patched by their mothers until the fabric became a collage of survival. Scraps from an uncle, a piece from an elder sibling, a sleeve stitched from something no longer recognizable. To them, winter clothing wasn't an outfit, it was hope. Keeping dry became a battle no one fully won. Medieval Europe offered no waterproof cloth. People rubbed wax or fat on cloaks to make the water bead for a time, but rain and snow eventually pushed through. Once soaked, garments grew heavy. Soaked wool could weigh several times its dry weight, and the wearer's body heat was pulled away as the moisture froze. Farmers knew the danger well. Chronicles mention how plowmen, caught in sudden storms, trudged home with frost-stiffened tunics that crackled as they walked, the water frozen within the fibers. Footwear offered even less protection. Leather boots softened in the wet, hardened in the cold, and cracked after repeated freezes. Many peasants had only wooden clogs or simple shoes bound with straps, leaving gaps for snow to slip inside. In accounts from 14th century France, travelers walking long distances in winter were told to wrap their feet in cloth before inserting them into their boots, not for comfort, but to slow the frostbite that crept in during prolonged freezes. No layering system existed, not in the modern sense. People wore what they had: a linen shirt, a wool tunic, perhaps a cloak pinned at the shoulder with a brooch. In colder regions, 2 tunics instead of 1. A hood if they owned one. Knitted caps in regions where the tradition survived, though knitting itself didn't spread widely across Europe until after the 13th century. Clothing was a puzzle assembled from necessity, patched through years of hardship. Nothing matched. Nothing was specialized. Everything was worn until it fell apart. Monasteries embroidered history into their inventories. Lists from 12th century English abbeys show monks were issued heavier cowls for winter, yet the cold still seeped through stone cloisters, a reminder that fabric alone could not conquer the season. Pilgrims walking to holy sites during December often recorded the misery of frozen rain hitting their unprotected faces, the stiffness of their clothing after nights spent near roadside shrines, their hands reddened and numb as cloth mittens failed to hold heat. For the wealthy, the tailor's workshop became a shield. Garments were lined, sometimes double-lined, stitched with layers of fur hidden between wool outer fabrics. Cloaks grew sweeping and heavy. Hoods became fitted. Boots were made with thicker leather and occasionally stuffed with wool felt. But even among nobility, winter remained a trial. Drafty stone keeps, icy corridors, and the continual fear of illness kept comfort limited. A lord's cloak might be magnificent, but could not change the temperature of a castle hall built to withstand siege rather than cold. The difference between rich and poor clothing widened sharply in years when temperatures plunged hard. During the colder phases of the medieval climate, anomalies declined, especially late 13th and early 14th centuries. Documents from Florence, Paris, and London described markets filled with people desperately searching for garments before the worst frosts. Prices spiked after poor wool yields or when sheep flocks were struck by disease. A cloak that cost a few pence one year could cost triple the next. Peasants sometimes went without, trusting old garments to last another season, even as the threads weakened in their hands. Children suffered most. Rural households often owned only one or two pieces of warm clothing suitable for winter, and these were prioritized for adults working outdoors. Some chronicles mention children spending entire winters indoors, wrapped in blankets, because stepping outside with inadequate clothing risked sickness, pneumonia, or worse. Travel became dangerous. Messengers riding across northern Europe in December faced snow that gathered on their cloaks until it formed a stiff shell. Each breath released steam into the linen layers beneath, adding to the moisture that later froze against their chests. Shoes stiffened. Gloves, simple leather or cloth without insulation, grew so rigid that reins had to be pried from riders' hands after long hours. Those who could not afford proper clothing went to great lengths to make do. In parts of Scandinavia, where winters bit harder, poorer families stuffed boots with moss for insulation, a tradition older than written records. In the Carpathians, shepherds used felt so thick it could stand upright on its own, not as a luxury, but as a barrier against wind. In the British Isles, cloaks were sometimes shared within families, handed from one person to the next depending on who needed to leave the house. Evidence appears in countless archaeological finds. Buttons replaced with wooden toggles, cloaks patched with whatever cloth could be spared, tunics resewn until their seams resembled rivers winding across a landscape of mismatched wool. Fibers tested under microscopes today reveal how often garments were reused, spun into new yarn, rewoven into new cloth, recycled until nothing was left. Some winters exposed the limits of even the best clothing. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rain ruined harvests and winter hunger tightened its grip, people lacked not only food, but the warmth to endure the season. Reports from Bruges describe families huddling together in single cloaks by smoldering fires of wet wood. That same period brought repeated freezes, making survival a calculation of calories and insulation, and many had neither. Yet clothing remained only one part of the struggle. Medieval winters forced people to confront their world with whatever protection they could craft from nature, and fabric could only offer so much. Every stitch carried a story, a fight against the cold that arrived each year with the same merciless certainty, the same reminder that warmth was not guaranteed, and that survival hinged on threads worn thin by the weight of history. Roads turned hostile long before snow fell, long before ice thickened on the rivers. By late October, the mud deepened into ruts so wide that carts sank to their axles, and every hoofprint became a trap waiting for the next traveler. Across medieval Europe, roads were little more than beaten earth. No gravel, no paving, nothing to stand firm against winter's assault. Once the rains came, travel slowed to a crawl, then to a halt, then to silence. Villages that sat only a few miles apart could become strangers for months. A messenger attempting to cross the English countryside in 1299 wrote of roads so drowned in mire that one may lose horse and hope alike. A simple journey that required hours in summer stretched into days in winter, and sometimes those days ended not in arrival, but in surrender. Travelers turned back, or did not return at all. Snow delivered the final blow. In harsher winters, like those recorded in 1205, 1306, and the brutal freeze of 1434, drifts swallowed pathways, erasing landmarks peasants relied on for direction. A turn too far left could lead into a forest. A turn too far right could lead into marshland frozen at the surface but soft beneath. Wind carved the landscape anew every night. So each morning felt like entering a world scraped clean of familiar markers. Isolation began tightening its grip. And then came the rivers, the true highways of medieval life, locking under sheets of ice. The Rhine froze hard enough in 1323 for people to walk across it. In the winter of 1407 to 1408, the Thames froze so thoroughly that merchants set up tents and stalls directly on the river surface. To the cheerful chroniclers who noted these moments, it seemed festive. But underneath the spectacle, the economic arteries of entire regions were shutting down. Ships remained trapped at port. Barges that carried grain between towns could no longer move. Fishermen found their harbors sealed behind walls of ice that stretched for miles. Salted fish stores dwindled. River trade vanished. The water routes that fed cities from Cologne to Paris to Bruges went silent beneath the frost. Coastal regions fared little better. Winter storms rolling in from the Atlantic made sailing nearly impossible. Strong winds shattered masts, tore sails, and smashed ships against harbor walls. Between December and February, most vessels stayed grounded unless absolutely necessary. Maritime records from the port of Lübeck and the Hanseatic League warned repeatedly against winter voyages, not for caution's sake alone, but because too many crews simply disappeared into storms that erased their ships without leaving a timber behind. Cities suffered first. Urban centers, proud, growing, hungry, depended on constant imports of food. London relied heavily on grain from surrounding shires. Florence depended on shipments from Tuscany's countryside. Paris, swelling in size by the 13th century, needed wheat deliveries almost daily. When the roads sank into mud and the rivers hardened into ice, carts and barges carrying grain stopped arriving, and fear crept into the narrow streets. Record books tell the story with numbers that hit like blows. In the cold winter of 1316, during the Great Famine, grain prices in some French towns tripled in a matter of weeks. Bakers rationed flour. Market stalls emptied. People lined up hoping for grain shipments that never came. And winter kept pressing forward, silent, steady, merciless. Rural villages lived through a different kind of standstill. With travel nearly impossible, they had to rely entirely on whatever they had stored before winter began. If harvests were poor, as they often were, isolation became dangerous. A family with too little food could not seek help from a neighboring village. A sick person could not be carried safely over half-frozen ground. Priests could not reach every home to give rites in time. Roads that once linked communities now lay buried under weeks' worth of snow. Winter stole movement, and with it connection. Merchants, the lifeblood of medieval economies, waited out the season with growing unease. Inns emptied. Market squares fell quiet except for local trade. Long-distance caravans from Italy, Germany, and Flanders suspended business for months. Goods that normally crossed mountain passes simply stayed where they were. Some years, the Alps closed early, snow sealing the passes until late spring. Traders trapped on the wrong side of range sometimes lost entire seasons of income. A world already fragile grew even more brittle. Messengers carrying royal letters faced some of the worst conditions. Royal courts, whether in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, depended on constant communication, yet winter reduced even the fastest riders to a walking pace. One chronicle from 1377 described a messenger whose horse slipped on frozen mud, breaking its leg. The messenger continued on foot, walking for days with the wind cutting through his cloak, because failing to deliver the message was not an option. But winter was indifferent. It punished loyalty with the same cold it gave everyone else. Peasants, lords, monks all shared the same constraint. Winter froze the world in place. Even armies could not move. Campaign seasons ended as soon as the ground became unmanageable. Knights could not charge over frozen mud that shattered underhoof. Siege engines could not be hauled across snow-choked roads. Supply wagons stalled. Commanders knew better than to fight winter, because winter never lost. That's why wars in medieval Europe followed a rhythm. Battles in spring, campaigns in summer, retreats in fall, and silence in winter. Silence that stretched for months. Small communities at the edges of kingdoms felt winter most severely. A village tucked into the Carpathians might go 3 months without seeing anyone from the outside. A coastal hamlet in Norway, lashed by storms, might rely entirely on whatever fish they salted in September. In the Highlands of Scotland, entire clans stayed within a few miles of their settlements until the snow receded. Stories passed across these lands speak of nights when winds rattled wool-stuffed windows and the world seemed to shrink to a single hearth's flickering glow. Travel did not merely slow, it vanished. And every vanished cart, every grounded ship, every frozen waterway tightened the noose around winter's victims. Cities rationed. Villages prayed their stores lasted. Noble households braced for shortages. Even monasteries, often better supplied, felt the strain when trade lines collapsed. Winter forced everyone into immobility. A stillness weighted with fear, hunger, and the quiet understanding that nothing moved until the thaw returned. There was no negotiation with frozen roads, no bargains with icebound rivers, no escape from the storms that grounded ships and silenced trade. Winter simply waited, patient, powerful, while the world held its breath, and people endured, knowing movement would not return until nature allowed it. Winter tightened its grip long before the first cough echoed through a crowded hall, long before a fever pushed its way into a household already worn thin by hunger. In the medieval world, the cold season did not arrive alone. It brought illness with it, moving through weakened bodies that had spent months eating less, working more, and sleeping under roofs that let the wind slip through every crack. By December, malnutrition had already started its slow, unforgiving work. People entered winter carrying the consequences of thin harvests, poor diets, and unrelenting labor. A body starved of meat, vegetables, and warmth could not defend itself. Chronic hunger, especially in years like 1315 or 1349, left immune systems fragile. Children felt it first, then their parents, then the elders whose strength had been fading since autumn. Each skipped meal made them easier prey for the illnesses that arrived with the cold. Respiratory infections ruled the season. Coughs rattled through timber houses where smoke from the hearth hung low and thick, irritating lungs and throats already raw from the wind. In towns, the problem grew worse. The narrow streets of Paris, York, and Ghent channeled winter winds like funnels, sending icy drafts whipping through open shutters. Crowded tenements trapped moisture inside, making the air heavy and damp, perfect for illness to pass from one person to the next. In monasteries, quiet, disciplined, orderly, winter still struck hard. Records kept by monks in England, France, and the German principalities note sharp rises in mortality between December and March. The community at Canterbury wrote in 1257 of a grievous cough that held the brothers with great distress. In the frozen lands of Scandinavia, monastic chroniclers mention winters so bitter that the ill could not be moved from their beds without risking further sickness. The cloisters offered prayer and routine, but not protection. Fevers came almost without warning. A person could feel perfectly well in the morning and fall weak by evening. Medieval physicians, bound by limited knowledge, struggled to explain these sudden turns. They relied on theories inherited from antiquity, imbalances of humors, vapors, cold air entering the body. Their treatments reflected their uncertainty. Warm compresses for the chest, syrups of honey and herbs, heated stones wrapped in cloth and placed near aching limbs. Some methods offered comfort, but very little cure. Home remedies varied from region to region. In 12th century England, household guides recommended mixtures of horehound or hyssop for winter coughs. In Italy, physicians blended spices like cinnamon and cloves into medicinal drinks, believing heat would push out disease. In Germany, warm beer mixed with herbs found its place in many households. These remedies filled the days with effort and hope, but the illnesses themselves often followed their own course, steady, stubborn, unbreakable. And the cold only intensified their reach. Wind frost stiffened the ground and snow piled along roads. People had no choice but to remain indoors. Entire families crowded together in spaces barely large enough for comfort. One hearth, one bed, one blanket shared among several children. A single cough spread through the room before anyone understood what was happening. In a matter of days, What began as a small illness could sweep through a household. Cities fared even worse. In medieval Paris, one of Europe's largest cities, thousands lived shoulder to shoulder inside, cramped buildings warmed by smoke-belching hearths. Winter moisture gathered on stone walls, dripping on a straw bedding that never had the chance to dry. Rats thrived in these shadows, and though they were not responsible for every illness, their presence added to the constant sense of vulnerability. In these crowded conditions, winter fevers and infections spread quickly, not as great outbreaks like the plague, but as the constant background sickness that marked every cold season. Doctors did what they could, consulting manuscripts, mixing herbs, relying on observation. But knowledge was limited. No germ theory, no concept of contagion, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. When a person grew ill, physicians focused on symptoms, the heat of the forehead, the sound of the cough, the color of the sputum, and offered treatments based on what they had learned from older writings. Some patients recovered naturally. Others weakened steadily, their bodies too drained by weeks of hunger to fight back. Mortality rose each winter, and everyone knew it. In towns across Flanders, parish records reveal clear patterns. Deaths climbing with the cold, easing only when spring began to thaw the earth. In Florence, chroniclers of the 14th century noted that winter deaths often doubled compared to summer. In London, burial rolls from the 1200s and 1300s show the same trend. The cold months claim more lives, especially among the very young and the elderly. The pattern repeated year after year, unbroken, accepted as the natural rhythm of life. For children, the season was particularly dangerous. Their bodies needed nourishment, and winter offered little. A mild cough could worsen quickly, turning into something harsher, an infection that tightened the chest and stole strength with every breath. Families kept watch through long nights, listening for changes in breathing, praying for signs of improvement. Some illnesses passed, others lingered and lingered until the household grew silent. Adults carried their own burdens. Men weakened from months of field labor stepped into winter already exhausted. Women, responsible for grinding grain, preparing meals, and caring for the sick, often collapsed last, but hardest. With every day of cold, their bodies burned precious energy to stay warm. Winter demanded more food, while offering less. Traveling healers sometimes arrived in towns with bags of herbs, tinctures, and powders gathered in warmer seasons. They offered treatments, advice, and comfort. Some had genuine skill, others relied on reputation alone, but all faced the same limits. They could describe an illness, soothe it, attempt to guide it, yet they could not stop it entirely. Monasteries documented these struggles with a quiet clarity. Their records show patterns that stretched across centuries. Each winter brought waves of coughs, fevers, aches, chills, and an increase in graves. Some winters passed gently, with only scattered illness. Others arrived like a shadow, heavy and lingering, pressing into every corner of the cloister. Brothers wrote carefully about these seasons, not with drama, but with steadiness. They listed names, dates, causes when known, and the entries always rose in number between December and March. In households across Europe, families knew these dangers well. Every winter carried the memory of a last. The faces lost, the illnesses endured, the nights spent awake listening to someone trying to breathe through the cold. They stocked herbs in early autumn, dried them carefully, and stored them in pots above the hearth. They prepared blankets, cloaks, whatever warmth they could gather, but nothing could fully shield them. Humidity from cooking fires created conditions that favored sickness. Windows stayed shut to keep out the cold, trapping air inside until it grew stale. Ash from hearths settled on bedding and clothing. Every breath carried the warmth and the weakness of a sealed room. The wealthy had advantages: larger homes, more food, warmer clothing. Yet even noble households recorded winter deaths. A stone manor shielded from wind could still host illness that swept through its servants' quarters, then into the family rooms. Even a well-fed body faced cold stress, and even a well-sheltered household had limited defenses when knowledge ran out. Winter illness was not always dramatic, but it was relentless. It crept through villages weakened by hunger. It found its way into towns through closed doors and shuttered windows. It moved through monasteries that tried to prepare for every season. It tightened its hold whenever food ran short, whenever fires failed, whenever the cold pressed harder against the world outside. And each year, as snow thickened on rooftops and frost spread across fields, people faced the same quiet fear, knowing illness waited in the shadows of winter, ready to strike the moment their strength faltered. Winter marched alongside every medieval army, a force that no commander could command, no strategist could outmaneuver, no sword could strike down. It watched from the edges of the battlefield during the warm months, and then, when the season shifted, it moved forward, silent, merciless, claiming the ground that soldiers had struggled so hard to win. Every commander knew the rule. Campaigns belonged to spring and summer. Armies moved when the roads were dry, when rivers flowed freely, when supply wagons could cross valleys without sinking or freezing. But sometimes war refused to wait for warmth. Sometimes ambition, desperation, or siege demands forced armies to remain in the field long after the cold began its slow descent. And when that happened, winter became the real enemy. The first blow struck the roads. Once the rains turned soil into a sucking mire, horses stumbled, wheels jammed, and soldiers slogged through mud that swallowed their boots. But mud was only the warning. When the ground froze, it hardened into a jagged surface that shattered hooves and cracked cart axles. By November, movement slowed to a crawl, and then stopped completely. Armies stranded on foreign soil found themselves fighting not only the enemy, but the season itself. Sieges pushed the limits even further. During winter, laying siege to a fortified town became an ordeal that tested every strand of human endurance. Supplies dwindled fast. Firewood burned quicker in the icy wind. Tents froze solid overnight. The Knights of the Teutonic Order, hardened by campaigns in Prussia, recorded winters so fierce that armor became brittle with frost and siege engines cracked under sudden drops in temperature. But they remained because a siege could not always be paused. A castle under pressure in September might still be resisting in January, and the attackers had no choice but to hold their lines. Food shortages began quietly, then loudly. Grain froze into solid blocks that needed to be broken apart with axes. Meat stiffened into something closer to wood than food. Ale turned cold and sour. Foraging became impossible. The land offered nothing but snow, ice, and the faint memory of past harvests. Soldiers rationed what they had and waited for the next day's cold to test them again. Every army dreaded frostbite, though they had no name for it, only symptoms. Hardening of fingers and toes, numbness that crept like a shadow, skin that blackened and split. Chroniclers wrote of soldiers whose feet lost all feeling during the winter of 1310 while guarding the siege lines around a fortress in Flanders. In the Alps, passes used during campaigns froze so hard that men collapsed mid-climb, their breath thickening in the air before disappearing entirely. Winter treated soldier and commander alike with the same brutal indifference. History gave count in 1242, near Lake Peipus. Freezing winds cut across the Baltic frontier as the forces of Novgorod and the Teutonic Knights clashed. Chroniclers described the lake's surface groaning under the weight of charging horses. Armor grew heavy with frost. Breath came out in clouds. The cold shaped every movement, every strike, every retreat. Even though the battle is remembered for its outcome, the chilling truth is that the frozen lake dictated the terms that day. On the far western front, English forces during the 100 Years' War often faced winters that halted campaigns entirely. In 1359, Edward III marched deep into France hoping for a decisive blow. Instead, he found storms, frozen earth, and supply shortages that forced him to withdraw. The cold had no interest in diplomacy, yet it brought negotiations to the table by breaking the stamina of armies far more effectively than any enemy could. Castles became prisons when winter closed in. A garrison trapped inside stone walls relied on whatever had been stored before autumn: barrels of grain, salted meat, dried vegetables. But even stone fortresses suffered when frost seeped into every crevice. Wells froze in extreme winters, a crisis recorded during the late 14th century in Central Europe. Soldiers huddled near braziers, wrapped in cloaks stiffened by cold, listening to the wind batter the shutters like a battering ram. And outside, the besieging army shivered in camps where canvas tents snapped like whips in the gale. Winter did not favor one side, it punished both. Campaigns in Scandinavia faced even harsher seasons. In Norway and Sweden, medieval armies sometimes moved across frozen lakes and rivers as if crossing vast plains. It saved time until the ice cracked. A count from the early 1500s, rooted in older medieval traditions, describes soldiers sinking beneath suddenly breaking ice, swallowed by the freezing water before their comrades could reach them. Even those who survived the plunge often succumbed later, their bodies weakened beyond recovery. Cold injuries were constant companions. Chilblains, swelling, blistering skin, these were common. But the deeper harm came when soldiers' strength faded from the cold faster than from combat. Archers whose hands grew numb could no longer pull their bows. Men-at-arms struggled to grip sword hilts with fingers that felt carved from stone. A knight in full armor was a formidable figure, until winter turned the steel against him, draining warmth from his body with each passing hour. Some winters decided wars outright. During the winter of 1429 to 1430, snowstorms around Orleans slowed English reinforcements and hampered their supply lines. The siege operations weakened just enough to give France the opening it needed months later. Winter didn't win battles by force, it won by erosion. Far to the east, in the winter campaigns of Rus, snowfall shaped military decisions as much as any ruler. Roads vanished. Forests thickened with silent drifts. Horses sank into snow up to their chests. Chroniclers wrote of campaigns postponed, halted, or abandoned entirely because the land transformed into an endless sheet of white resistance. Even the Crusades bowed to winter's influence. The bitter cold in the mountains of Anatolia drained Crusader armies marching toward the Holy Land in 1097 to 1098. Supplies froze. Pack animals died. Soldiers wrapped themselves in every layer they owned. Yet the cold seeped in anyway. Relentless, unyielding. And still, commanders pressed on when they had to. Because winter did more than stall armies, it cornered them. It turned hunger from an inconvenience into a weapon. It turned cold from discomfort into danger. It turned travel from hardship into impossibility. Siege lines held only as long as supply wagons could reach them. And once snow blocked the routes, armies knew the clock had started ticking. One brutal winter could erase favorable odds. One storm could undo months of planning. One freeze could turn victory into retreat. Every soldier understood this. Every commander feared it. Winter shaped the medieval battlefield long before metal clashed with metal. It claimed ground without drawing a blade. It weakened armies without shedding blood. It stood indifferent to treaties, alliances, and ambitions. And when it arrived, when the first frost spread across the land, the bravest knights, the strongest soldiers, the most determined armies found themselves facing an opponent that no strategy could outthink, an enemy whose advance could not be stopped, whose presence defined the limits of medieval warfare. And every winter reminded them that war was never just fought against human rivals. It was fought against the season itself, a force older, colder, and far more patient than any army on earth. Winter pressed itself into the medieval mind long before the first snow landed. A force too vast to ignore, too relentless to fully understand. Faith tried to explain it. Fear tried to survive it. And folklore tried to give it shape, turning the cold season into something more than weather. Something with intention, with meaning. When winter struck with unusual severity, people searched the heavens for answers. The Chronicles of 1315 recorded rains that refused to end, crops failing, hunger tightening its grip across northern Europe. Priests stood before shivering congregations and spoke of sin, of punishment, of a world that had strayed from God's favor. Autumn's collapse into bitter cold was not simply misfortune, it was a message. And every gust of freezing wind felt like a warning carried across the land. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christianity framed winter within a wider struggle, a world caught between spiritual order and chaos. Cold, darkness, and scarcity became reminders that God's protection could fade if people drifted into moral complacency. A severe frost could be interpreted as a chastisement, a nudge toward repentance. In the winter of 1258, after volcanic eruptions darkened the skies and temperatures dropped across Europe, preachers called the strange cold a sign of divine displeasure. People gathered in processions, carrying relics through snowbound streets, hoping their humility would shift the season's cruelty. Yet Christianity was not the only lens through which medieval people viewed the cold. Older traditions lingered beneath the surface. Fragments of pagan beliefs, ancestral rituals, and whispered superstitions that refused to disappear. Winter held its own spirits, its own dangers, and people tried to understand it through stories that carried the weight of centuries. In the Germanic north, the long winter nights brought talk of the wild hunt, a furious procession moving across the sky, led by a spectral figure whose identity shifted from region to region. Some spoke of Woden, others of a ghostly lord accompanied by restless souls. The storm winds were said to be the echo of their passing. To hear them was a warning, to see them was a threat. Families barred their doors when the wind howled, terrified that one glance into the storm could invite disaster. Winter folklore fed on fear, not irrational fear, but fear shaped by experience. Darkness lasted longer. Food ran thin. The line between survival and loss narrowed with each passing night. In Scandinavia, where winter swallowed nearly half the year, traditions blended with Christian belief in ways that kept older meanings alive. Yule became a celebrated feast after the Christianization of the region, yet still bore traces of pre-Christian ritual. Fires burned through the long nights, a defense against the cold and a symbolic stand against forces believed to wander freely during the darkest weeks. The Yule log, carried into homes and set alight, was more than decoration. It was protection, a stubborn flame refusing to yield to the frost outside. Across the Alps, villagers whispered about Perkta, a winter figure with shifting roles depending on the region. Sometimes a protector, sometimes a punisher. She walked the winter nights, checking that households worked honestly, that food was prepared correctly, that children behaved. When the nights grew longest, costumed processions swept through villages, reenacting her wanderings, a cultural memory that reached back to times before written records. Even in the Christian Middle Ages, people believed winter carried beings that tested the order of the world. The Slavic lands held their own winter spirits. Morana, the embodiment of death and winter, appeared in local customs across centuries. To mark the end of winter, villagers fashioned straw figures symbolizing her and cast them into rivers or burned them, a ritual older than Christianity itself. It acknowledged winter's power and the relief that came when it finally loosened its hold. Not all winter folklore was fear. Some of it offered comfort, a reminder that even in the coldest months, traditions could bring warmth. Festivals glittered against the season's bleakness. The Feast of St. Nicholas on December 6th brought gifts to children in parts of Central and Western Europe, a moment of kindness amid the hardship. The Calends rituals, inherited from late Roman customs, carried on in various regions through singing, masking, and fortune-telling. Medieval Christmas blended solemn liturgy with laughter, music, and food, creating a shield, however temporary, against the season's hardships. In England, winter brought the tradition of wassailing, going door to door with songs, wishing health to households in exchange for drink. It wasn't merely celebration. It reinforced community ties when people needed them most. Cold weather isolated villages, but rituals gathered them together. holding the fragile threads of society intact. Even the harshest winters produced customs that helped people cope with the fear they couldn't name outright. In the far north, Sami reindeer herders marked the winter solstice with observations tied to the movement of the stars and the behavior of the animals they lived alongside. Cold was not an enemy in those lands. It was a teacher demanding skill and respect. Their traditions, though different from the settled agricultural communities of Europe, carried the same truth. Winter required more than strength. It required understanding. The medieval world lived in constant conversation with winter. Faith explained the cold through divine will. Folklore explained it through beings, spirits, and ancient forces woven into stories passed down for generations. And fear filled the spaces between faith and folklore, shaping rituals that kept the cold at bay. When famine struck in the winter of 1316, some chroniclers wrote that the devil walked the land. But others described processions led by clergy carrying candles through the streets, lights pushing back the darkness, symbolizing endurance more than terror. Even in despair, rituals offered direction, something to hold on to. Winter superstitions weren't random inventions. They were survival tools. People believed breaking certain taboos during the cold months would anger spirits or bring misfortune. Not because they sought mysticism, but because every action in winter carried consequences. Wasting food wasn't simply wrong. It could threaten a family's survival. Letting the fire die out wasn't just negligence. It invited cold into the home with dangerous ease. Stories gave weight to those realities. Medieval households marked the passing winter weeks with traditions that blended sacred and ancestral meaning. On Candlemas, February 2nd, people brought candles to church to be blessed, believing they offered protection against storms and hardship. The date also aligned with older agricultural cycles, marking a faint shift toward spring. Even in the darkest winters, people looked for signs, small, fragile signals that the world had not abandoned them. In the far corners of Europe, people told stories of winter witches, wandering spirits, and creatures that fed on fear. But beneath every story lay a truth. Winter changed everything. It reshaped the rhythms of life, carved its presence into culture, and forced medieval society to wrestle with forces far beyond human control. Faith softened the fear. Folklore gave it form. Rituals built a bridge between hardship and hope. And through it all, winter remained vast, ancient, impenetrable, pressing itself into the beliefs of millions, shaping traditions that survived long after the Middle Ages faded, trailing their echoes through the cold months, year after year, century after century. In the final years of the 13th century, something in the rhythm of the seasons shifted, slowly at first, then unmistakably. Harvests that had once relied on predictable warmth began to falter. Storms rolled in with a force that unsettled even the oldest farmers. By the early 1300s, Europe stood at the threshold of a climatic transformation that would stretch across generations. A long, grinding descent into colder winters that reshaped entire societies. The Little Ice Age did not announce itself with a single event. It crept in through years like 1315, when relentless rains drowned the fields of northern Europe, ushering in the Great Famine. Wheat fields rotted where they stood. Grain stores emptied. Livestock died in the mud. And when winter followed in 1316, it carried a sharpness that pierced straight through the weakened. For countless families, cold was no longer a season. It was an adversary. Tree-ring data, ice cores, and contemporary chronicles point toward a cluster of forces. Volcanic eruptions, shifts in ocean circulation, subtle changes in solar activity. Medieval people had no access to such explanations. They simply knew the winters were lengthening, tightening, pressing harder. By the mid-14th century, reports from the Baltic spoke of harbors sealing under ice thick enough to support wagons. Traders in Lubeck and Gdansk watched as routes that had once linked kingdoms disappeared beneath frozen sheets stretching into the distance. In 1408 to 1409, The Baltic Sea froze so completely that travelers crossed from Denmark to Sweden on foot, an event chroniclers wrote with astonishment, yet without comfort. These weren't marvels. They were warnings. Cities fell at first. Packed streets, crowded homes, stores of grain already strained. A cold snap could turn an entire quarter desperate. In London, the River Thames froze repeatedly through the 15th and 16th centuries. Its surface transformed into a strange, solid world where markets and tents appeared, yet every frost fair had a shadow behind its laughter. Frost fairs were born of necessity, not celebration. When the river froze, trade halted, barges lay trapped, food deliveries slowed or stopped. Beneath the merriment, the cold held the city in a grip that tightened with each passing week. Rural households fared no better. Shorter growing seasons meant barley, rye, and wheat struggled to ripen before the onset of autumn frost. In alpine villages, glaciers advanced slowly but relentlessly, creeping toward pastureland that had once fed cattle through the summer. The glacier at Chamonix pushed so far into the valley that in 1643 villagers held mass at its edge, begging it to recede. They prayed not from superstition, but from lived terror. Losing pasture meant losing animals. Losing animals meant losing life. Across Scandinavia, winters grew so harsh that settlements in Greenland, founded by Norse colonists around 985, began to weaken. Archaeological layers show dwindling livestock, thinner bones from poorer diets, and abandoned farmsteads. By the early 1400s, the eastern settlement faded, and by the late 1400s, the western settlement was silent. The cold had claimed its edge of the world. Russia endured its own trials. During the winter of 1601 to 1603, following the massive eruption of Wineputina in 1600, temperatures plummeted across Eurasia. Crops failed throughout the Russian heartland, contributing to one of the worst famines in its recorded history. As many as 2 million lives were lost. Winters stretched long past their usual bounds, and entire communities found themselves trapped, unable to plant, unable to feed themselves, unable to resist the weight of a climate turned unpredictable. The Ottoman Empire, accustomed to fertile Anatolian plains and stable cycles, felt the changing winters cut into its grain supplies. In the 1590s and early 1600s, a series of severe winters and droughts destabilized rural production, contributing to uprisings and migrations as people searched for land that could still sustain them. Cold was no longer just an environmental challenge. It had become a political one. Societies responded in whatever ways they could. Some regions shifted their agricultural calendars, experimenting with hardier crops. Rye became a staple in places where wheat once dominated. Coastal towns adapted by storing larger quantities of salted fish and grain. Yet innovation often struggled against the sheer force of the weather. In the Netherlands, where water shaped everything from farming to trade, colder winters created new conditions. Canals froze, turning transport routes into frozen roads. Dutch artisans perfected ice skates, a technology that merged need with ingenuity. What began as a survival tool eventually became a cultural tradition, but its origins lay in the brutal necessity of moving across a frozen world. Migration became another answer. Highland communities in Scotland and Norway descended into lower valleys with more reliable growing seasons. Families in France's mountainous regions abandoned villages that had stood for centuries. In Iceland, volcanic eruptions combined with colder winters to hammer a population already living close to the edge. By the 1700s, the island's numbers had dropped significantly. Everywhere, cold reshaped lives. Famine haunted the margins of the Little Ice Age. In 1695 to 1697, the so-called 7 ill years struck Scotland, where consecutive cold seasons ruined harvests and killed livestock. The population fell by 10 to 15%. In Finland, the Great Famine of 1696 to 1697 took an even greater share, around 25 to 30% of the population. Streets and towns fell silent as families barricaded themselves indoors against the cold they could not escape. But even in the middle of hardship, people adapted. They built homes with thicker walls. They changed the timing of their work. They held winter gatherings not only for celebration, but for morale. Oral traditions record stories of endurance. Families huddled around central hearths, villages supporting one another through months when the world outside felt suspended between ice and darkness. Trade routes adjusted. Merchants timed their shipments more carefully, avoiding seasons when storms could trap ships in iced-over harbors. States introduced grain storage regulations, attempting to soften the blow of failure years. None of it eliminated the suffering, but it kept societies moving forward. Climate touched art and memory as well. Painters in the 16th and 17th centuries, from Peter Bruegel the Elder to Hendrik Averkamp, filled their landscapes with frozen rivers and snow-covered fields, not simply for beauty, but because such scenes had become part of daily experience. Their work shows a Europe where winter dominated the horizon, pressing itself into the visual record. Year after year, generation after generation, medieval and early modern people stood against winters that seemed determined to press harder than the last. They endured cold snaps that froze the ground solid until spring came late. They endured shortages that forced them to stretch every grain, every preserved fruit, every dried fish. They endured storms that smashed coastal villages and swallowed fields whole. They endured the uncertainty of waking each year to a world more unpredictable than the one before. And across those centuries, they carried on, reshaping their lives around a climate that refused to soften. Living through winters that carved themselves into the memory of Europe, winters that stretched from the 1300s into the 1800s, holding entire societies in their grasp. Winters that demanded resilience far beyond the ordinary. Winters that left their mark on every life they touched.